On March 4, 2026, 5 days into the joint U.S.-Israeli air campaign, a senior Iranian military official told ISNA, Iran's state-run news agency, that Iran's remaining missiles would be aimed at the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center at Dimona. The exact phrasing reported by ISNA, Iran's final effective missiles would target Dimona and regional energy infrastructure if the United States and Israel continued pursuing regime change. That statement, attributed to an Iranian military official through official Iranian state media, was not rhetorical noise aimed at a domestic audience. It was a calculated threat delivered through a channel that functions as Iran's official communications mechanism, placed on the public record in the middle of an active war. The word choice matters before anything else. Final effective missiles is not the language of a confident arsenal. It is the language of a command structure that knows its launch capacity has been degraded and is making a specific decision about where to concentrate what remains. Iran was not claiming to have unlimited capability. It was signaling the opposite, and then naming the one target it calculated would impose the highest possible cost with what it still had. That is the strategic logic behind naming Dimona. Not the language of strength, the language of leverage. To understand why this threat carries the way it does, need to understand what Dimona actually is, not what Israeli officials say it is, and not what Iranian state media claims, but what the confirmed historical and open source record shows. The official designation is the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center. It sits approximately 13 kilometers southeast of the city of Dimona in southern Israel, roughly 90 kilometers from Jerusalem. Israel began construction of the facility in the late 1950s with French technical assistance, a fact confirmed by declassified U.S. diplomatic cables and the historical record. For years, Israeli officials described the site to American diplomats as a textile factory in the Negev desert, surrounded by electrified perimeter fencing, patrol roads, and hardened underground infrastructure built to survive attack. Those declassified documents confirmed the deception was sustained at senior levels across multiple administrations. Open source satellite analysis describes a complex with multiple buildings across a broad desert footprint, the underground laboratory and processing space designed to be functionally invisible from the outside. This is not a civilian research campus in the conventional sense. It is a fortified strategic facility built to survive war. Israel's policy toward the facility has never changed since it was built. Israel has never confirmed the existence of a nuclear weapons program. Israel has never denied it. That posture, sustained for over 6 decades, is known as nuclear ambiguity, and it is a deliberate strategic doctrine, not an accident of omission. The logic is straightforward. Force every adversary to assume the worst about what Israel possesses without providing precise numbers. To model or triggering the diplomatic consequences that open declaration would create. Ambiguity serves deterrence. But ambiguity cuts in both directions. The same uncertainty that deters escalation also means Israel cannot publicly assess or respond to threats against Dimona without trading 60 years of deliberate policy for admission. Israel cannot publish a detailed threat assessment of the facility without confirming what it has spent those 60 years denying. It cannot show the storage map, the containment design, the depth of the underground infrastructure, or the consequence of a breach, because doing so ends the ambiguity permanently. So the public language from Israeli officials remains vague, protected, secure, resilient. The real conversation happens in classified rooms where planners don't debate politics. They debate wind direction, interceptor inventory, and response timelines. The SIPRI Yearbook 2025 lists Israel among nuclear-armed states, estimating more than 80 nuclear warheads, with approximately 30 assessed as air deliverable and around 50 as ballistic missile warheads. CUM plus fissile material assessed to be sufficient for a significantly larger arsenal. Whether those numbers are precisely accurate is not the analytically relevant point. The relevant point is that Dimona represents a stockpile of fissile material accumulated over decades of production operations. Open source nuclear analysts, including assessments published by the Federation of American Scientists, have estimated annual plutonium production at the site in the single-digit kilogram range. Numbers that sound abstract until you understand what that material is produced for and where it is stored. Iran just put that site on the table. The threat carries additional weight because of what is already confirmed about Iran's current military situation. According to U.S. CENTCOM public statements and analysis by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Iran's ballistic missile launch rate had fallen approximately 80 to 90% from the opening days of the conflict by the time this threat was issued. That reduction is the direct result of US and Israeli strikes on Iranian launch infrastructure confirmed by both CENTCOM and Israeli military. Statements identifying hundreds of launcher positions struck since February 28th. A reduced firing rate is not the same as zero capability. What it means operationally is that Iran can no longer fire everywhere. It has to choose where. And the choice of Dimona, a single fixed point, changes the geometry of the defensive problem Israel and the U.S. face. Because the entire architecture of multi-layered missile defense was built to handle volume distributed across many targets simultaneously, concentrating every remaining effective missile on one coordinate forces that architecture into a narrower and harder version of its task. Perfect performance against potentially maneuvering warheads, against a compressed timeline, against a single sector. That is a different problem from defending a country against a distributed salvo. There is an open source precedent that should not be dismissed. In April 2021, during an unrelated Syrian air defense engagement, surface-tier missile, not a ballistic warhead, not a targeted strike, an interceptor that went off course, fell in the vicinity of the Dimona area. That incident was reported by multiple outlets, including Reuters and Haaretz. It was not a targeted attack. It was not an Iranian missile. It was the unguided outcome of an entirely different engagement in a different theater. And it ended up uncomfortably close to Israel's most sensitive nuclear site. If that can happen as a side effect of a Syrian intercept, the question of what a deliberate concentrated salvo from Iran's remaining ballistic missile force could do to that site is not a theoretical question. It is a planning problem that Israel's defense establishment is actively working in real time. Iran has refined its approach to missile saturation through 4 escalation cycles before this war began. April 2024 was the first direct Iranian ballistic missile strike from Iranian territory onto Israeli soil. The opening of that doctrine, October 2024, expanded the scale. June 2025's 12-day war pushed it further still, with Iran firing the largest Iranian missile campaign directed at Israel in history up to that point. February 28th to March 2026 represents the 4th cycle, the largest yet. In each prior cycle, Iran's strategy was volume distributed across many target sets, air bases, radar installations, military headquarters, open terrain intended to overwhelm through sheer quantity. The Dimona threat represents a doctrinal shift, not volume, concentration, fewer launchers, fewer missiles, but every remaining effective one aimed at a single coordinate. That is a different threat structure from every prior Iranian missile operation, and it is specifically designed to exploit the one scenario multi-layered defense handles worst. Israel's layered missile defense is among the most sophisticated in operational service anywhere on Earth. Arrow 3 handles ballistic missiles above the atmosphere. Arrow 2 handles ballistic missiles inside the atmosphere. David Sling handles medium and long-range ballistic threats and large rockets. Iron Dome handles short-range rockets and projectiles. American Aegis vessels and THAAD batteries deployed to the region add additional intercept layers beyond what Israel operates independently. That architecture is real, tested, and has performed substantially during every prior Iranian missile campaign. But missile defense is probability management under pressure, not absolute guarantee. Every system has a kill probability per intercept attempt, a number less than 100% by definition. When the target is a single fixed point, and every incoming missile is aimed at that point, the question becomes, what happens if even one gets through? At an airfield, one failure is a crater on a runway. At Dimona, one failure is a different category of event entirely. Let's be technically precise about what a strike on Dimona would and would not mean, because the distinction matters. A ballistic missile impact on the Dimona site would not produce a nuclear detonation in the weapon sense. Nuclear weapons require specific engineering, specific geometries, specific triggering sequences that do not occur from external impact alone. That is confirmed physics and confirmed by the broad consensus of nuclear safety engineers. What a strike could produce is radiological contamination. Dimona is a research and production facility that has operated continuously for over 6 decades. It has handled, processed, and stored fissile and radioactive material throughout that entire period. A breach of containment caused by the physical destruction of surface or near-surface structures, by fire, by secondary explosions from conventional warheads, could release radioactive material into the surrounding environment. The scale of a potential release would depend on factors that are not publicly known. The current state of containment infrastructure, the depth of storage, the specific materials present, and the severity of the strike. Open source nuclear analysts have assessed the site's history as consistent with decades of plutonium production and storage. The risk from a breach is not a nuclear explosion. The risk is a contamination plume. And once you are talking about a contamination plume, you are no longer talking about borders. The Negev Desert sits in a region with several neighboring countries within plume range under varying wind conditions. Jordan lies to the east. Egypt lies to the southwest. The Gulf of Aqaba, shared between Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, lies to the south. A contamination event does not cross checkpoints, moves where the atmosphere carries it, under meteorological conditions that neither Iran nor Israel controls. This is not a projection of certainty. It is an analytical description of the risk architecture that a strike on Dimona introduces to the regional environment. That is what makes this threat structurally different from any other Iranian targeting statement in this conflict. A strike on Al Udeid ends U.S. operations at that base. Strike on Ras Laffan disrupts LNG exports. Strike on a carrier damages American naval power projection. All of those are recoverable military or economic events with containable consequences. A radiological release at Dimona introduces consequences that do not respect military objectives, ceasefire timelines, or national borders. Iran made this threat on March 4th for a specific reason, and that reason is directly tied to the stated political objectives Washington and Tel Aviv have been voicing since Operation Epic Fury began. The stated goal of this campaign, as articulated publicly by officials in both governments, goes beyond neutralizing Iran's nuclear program. It includes language describing regime change, the elimination of the Islamic Republic as a political structure. From Iran's perspective, if the objective is the complete elimination of the regime, then the cost-benefit calculation changes entirely. A government fighting for its political survival does not calculate as a government managing a limited military exchange. It calculates as an institution that believes its existence is already forfeit. In that context, the deterrence logic behind naming Dimona becomes clear. Iran cannot match American air power. Its air defense layers have been degraded. Its launcher infrastructure has been struck. Its naval assets have been reduced substantially. But it can still name a target that raises the political cost of continuing to the point where the objective must either narrow or the war must end. Kima is the weaponization of consequence. It is Iran using the specter of what a desperate last strike could set in motion to force a decision in Washington before that last strike becomes rational to attempt. The threat is explicitly conditional. The ISNA statement tied it directly to the continuation of regime change intent. That conditionality makes every public statement out of Washington and Tel Aviv in the coming days more strategically significant than usual. If Washington signals publicly or through back channels that its objective is limited to nuclear capability and missile infrastructure, Iran's declared trigger conditions narrow. The threat remains in the open, but the probability of execution drops. If Washington maintains explicit regime change framing, Iran's command structure must decide whether the trigger has already been effectively pulled. If Washington says nothing, if domestic political constraints prevent any public moderation of objectives, Iran's decision-making environment becomes more unstable, because ambiguity about intent breeds miscalculation in exactly the kind of compressed timeline that an active war creates. A war at this stage does not require one side to want catastrophe. It only requires one side to misread the other's intent at a moment when the decision window is measured in minutes. The financial markets were already responding to the Dimona threat before the question of execution became real. Markets do not require certainty. They price probability. When a nuclear research facility enters the confirmed public threat landscape of an active war, risk models change in ways that compound quickly. Oil prices rise because the geopolitical risk premium expands beyond what energy supply disruption alone justifies. War risk insurance premiums rise because underwriters extend worst-case modeling into scenarios previously assigned near-zero probability. CUP. The moment a nuclear research site becomes a named, publicly recorded target in an active conflict, the range of modeled outcomes widens in a way that pricing systems handle poorly. You can model a missile strike on a military base, a refinery fire, a temporary closure of a critical waterway. You cannot easily model a radiological incident in the middle of a war in which no ceasefire framework currently exists. That uncertainty gap between modeled and unmodeled risk is itself a price, and it compounds every day. Conflict continues without a defined endpoint. The most important analytical point about the Dimona threat is this: it permanently changes the strategic landscape, regardless of whether the strike ever happens. Before March 4, 2026, Dimona was the subtext of Middle East strategic planning for 6 decades. Every government with a serious regional presence modeled around it. No state actor named it publicly as a target while holding an operational missile force. That threshold has now been crossed. The threat exists on a public record. It was issued through official Iranian state media by an identified military official. It is cited in this video with its source. Even if Operation Epic Fury ends tomorrow, even if a ceasefire holds, even if Iran's missile forces are completely degraded and never fire another round, this threat is now part of the open strategic record. It becomes a reference point in every future escalation cycle. It becomes a line item in every future nuclear arms control negotiation. It becomes the precedent every future Iranian commander can cite if a future government makes the same calculation. The world in which Dimona was only ever a subtext is not the world that exists after. March 4, 2026. The immediate decision window is not measured in months. It is measured in hours and days, in direct proportion to how long the explicit regime change framing remains active in Washington's public posture. Rakchi's NBC interview on March 5, one day after the Dimona threat, confirmed Iran's position. We are not asking for a ceasefire. Don't see any reason to negotiate. The back channel that the New York Times reported, Iran's Ministry of Intelligence reaching out to the CIA through a third country's intelligence service while publicly refusing to negotiate, tells you the civilian track still exists beneath the surface. But the civilian track and the IRGC's targeting decisions are not the same track. That is the structural reality this entire conflict has demonstrated repeatedly since. February 28th, the civilian government signals, the IRGC fires. And as of March 4th, the IRGC's public signal is a named target 90 kilometers south of Jerusalem. The Negev is quiet at night. According to an Iranian military official speaking through Iran's state media, The missiles still pointed at it are not.